I had rented a small cabin in Canada for a week, planning to get away from everything. It was one of those places you book because the pictures look quiet and peaceful, tucked into the woods with a small lake nearby. I imagined mornings with coffee on the porch, long hikes during the day, maybe a fire in the evening. No crowds, no traffic, no distractions, just space to breathe. The cabin was simple. 2 rooms, wooden floors that creaked when you walked, a stone fireplace, and one big front door that opened to a small porch. The first night I stayed there, I felt comfortable enough. It was remote, but not unsettling. I cooked some food, sat on the porch until the mosquitoes got too thick, and then went inside. The silence was deep, but I told myself that was part of the appeal. I locked the door, checked the windows, and went to bed. The next morning, I got up early, made some coffee, and stepped outside to take in the cool air. That's when I noticed it. A length of rope was tied tightly around the exterior door handle. It looped in several knots, pulled snug, almost like someone had cinched it as hard as they could. I froze, staring at it. I hadn't seen it the night before, and I knew it hadn't been there when I locked up and gone to bed. The rope wasn't old either. It looked new, thick and clean, like something you'd buy recently at a hardware store. It hadn't just been tossed or left. It had been tied there deliberately. The handle was wrapped so that it would have been difficult to open the door from the inside if I hadn't noticed it. I felt a chill run through me. Whoever tied it had to have come up to the cabin in the middle of the night while I was inside sleeping. They had been right at the door, just feet away from where I lay in bed. I stood there for a long time, staring at the knots. My mind ran through possibilities. Maybe it was some prank, though who would even know I was there? The cabin was remote, and I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. It could have been someone from a nearby property messing around, but there were no nearby houses. I untied the rope slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. The knots were tight, and it took effort to loosen them. Whoever tied it had meant for it to stay secure. When I finally pulled it free, I coiled it up in my hands and set it on the porch railing. The whole day after that, I couldn't relax. Every sound in the woods made me turn my head. I went for a short walk down to the lake, but I kept glancing back toward the cabin, half expecting to see someone standing near it. My appetite was gone, and I kept going over the same thought. Someone had been there. Someone had walked up to the door of the cabin while I was asleep inside. By evening, the quiet that I had liked before now felt oppressive. The trees pressed in, the shadows stretched long, and I couldn't stop imagining someone standing just beyond them, watching. I tried to read a book, tried to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. When night came, I didn't sleep much. I left the light on in the main room, sat in a chair facing the door, and listened. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps outside, faint crunches in the dirt. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, I didn't see anything. By morning, I felt exhausted. I went to open the door, hesitant but needing to see. My stomach dropped when I saw the rope again. It was tied around the handle, the same as before. The same tight knots pulled snug. That was enough. I knew it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't something I could ignore. Someone was coming to the cabin at night, standing at the door, and deliberately tying it shut. Maybe to scare me, maybe with worse intentions. I untied the rope again, my hands shaking. This time, I didn't leave it on the railing. I tossed it into the fire pit and lit it, watching the flames catch and the fibers curl black. I wasn't going to give them the chance to use it again. I packed my things in a rush after that. I didn't even bother with breakfast. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like whoever had tied the rope might still be in the woods, waiting to see what I'd do. When I loaded my bag into the car and started down the dirt road, I didn't look back. I kept driving until I reached the nearest town, my shoulders tense, checking the rearview mirror again and again. Later, when I thought about it, I realized what unsettled me most. The rope hadn't been there during the day. It had only ever appeared in the morning. That meant it was tied at night while I was asleep just feet away. It also meant that whoever did it had probably been close enough to know when I'd gone to bed, and bold enough to come right up to the door in total silence. I never reported it, Never even told the rental company. I just left and didn't go back. But the image has stayed in my mind. The knots pulled tight, the handle wrapped as if to hold the door shut, or maybe to hold me in. I had gone to that cabin looking for quiet, for peace, but what I found was a reminder that isolation cuts both ways. Out there was no one to hear me if something happened. No one to notice if I never came back. The rope was simple, just an everyday object. But in that place, in that context, it meant something terrifying. It meant someone had chosen me, singled me out, and stood right at my door in the night. And I'll never know what they were planning if I hadn't left when I did. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. Work had been too much, and the city felt like it was draining me. The listing showed a small place tucked in the woods, a little rough around the edges but private. Privacy was exactly what I wanted. It was early fall, the leaves turning, the air sharp in the mornings but still warm during the day. When I drove up the dirt road and saw the cabin sitting back under tall trees, it looked perfect, old but solid. The first day was quiet. I carried my bag inside, looked around, and noticed right away how simple the place was. A wood stove, a couple of chairs, a kitchen table, and a bed in the corner. There was no TV, no phone signal, just silence and the woods. I unpacked, walked around outside, and felt good about the choice. The air was cleaner than back home, and there was nothing but the wind and the occasional crow. That night, I built a fire, ate some food I'd brought, and sat reading by lantern light. Felt peaceful. But as it got later, I started to notice the quiet was different than what I was used to. It wasn't city quiet. Out here, every sound was sharper, more defined. A stick cracking outside made me freeze and listen. The wind moving against the siding felt like something brushing close to the walls. I tried to shake it off, telling myself this was what I came for, to be away from noise, to get used to being alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers. The room was almost dark. Then I heard something soft, steady crunches in the leaves outside. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart started pounding. I lay perfectly still, trying to decide if I should get up, but the steps moved around the walls, close enough that I could hear them stop every so often, like whoever it was paused to listen. I stayed frozen until the sound faded, but even after it stopped, I didn't sleep. I sat up, watching the cabin windows, straining to catch any sign of movement. Morning eventually came, and the world outside looked harmless again, the sunlight spilling over wet leaves. I walked the perimeter, checking for tracks. The ground was damp, and sure enough, I saw faint impressions in the dirt. They weren't animal prints. They were boots. The thought of someone walking around the cabin unsettled me, but I tried to reason through it. Maybe a hunter passed by in the night, or someone from a nearby cabin just moving through. The idea made sense in the daylight, and I let it go. The second night, it happened again. Same time, same sound. Steps in the leaves, slow, deliberate. My stomach twisted as I lay there, ears straining. They circled the cabin again, stopping in different spots. I sat up and quietly placed a chair under the front doorknob, even though the door already had a lock. I didn't light the lantern. I wanted it to look as though I was still asleep. Hours passed before the sound finally faded. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I checked outside again. This time I found clearer prints in the dirt leading up close to the back wall, right under one of the windows. They didn't continue on. Whoever it was had walked in circles, just like the night before, then stopped under the window. That detail shook me. I thought about leaving early, but part of me didn't want to panic. I told myself maybe it was some local messing with the place. Maybe the prints weren't new, and I was letting my imagination build it into something worse than it was. Still, I couldn't shake the way the footsteps always circled, never coming or going, just round and round. The third night was the worst. I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat in the chair with the lantern off. The fire burned low, my ears sharp for every sound. When the footsteps started, I was ready for them, but it didn't make them easier to hear. Same slow crunch, circling. Sometimes they stopped for a long stretch, then started again. My hands sweated even though the room was cold. At one point, the steps came closer than before. They stopped right outside the wall where I was sitting. The silence was heavy, like someone was standing still, listening to me breathe. My chest felt tight. I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, the steps started again, circling, fading, then returning. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, barely ate, and carried everything to the car. I looked back at the cabin one last time before leaving. Something about it felt different now, darker, like it wasn't just a harmless little place in the woods anymore. The drive back to town was long and tense. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see a car behind me, though the road was empty. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt some relief, but it didn't erase what I'd felt out there. I never saw who it was. I never found out why the footprints circled again and again, why they stopped under the window, why they only came at night. Maybe it was someone living nearby who liked to scare renters. Maybe it was something worse, someone waiting for the right moment to do more than walk in circles. All I know is that I'll never rent another cabin that remote again. Privacy wasn't what I found out there. What I found was the feeling of being watched, night after night, by someone who never wanted to be seen. And that feeling hasn't left me since. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forest with a few friends after a long hiking trip. We wanted a place where we could rest up for a few days, cook on a stove instead of a campfire, and sleep in actual beds before heading back out on the trails. The cabin was basic but nice enough. 2 bedrooms, a front porch, and a single large window in the main living area that looked out toward the trees. The first night was peaceful. We made dinner, opened a couple of beers, and sat around the table laughing and going over the route we had taken. It was quiet out there. No sound of cars or people, just wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. When it got late, we turned in, grateful to be out of our tents for once. The second day, after a long hike to a ridge a few miles away, we got back to the cabin in the late afternoon. While the others went inside to get water and stretch out, I wandered around the edge of the property. I like to look at the surroundings when I stay somewhere remote. See the paths, the trees, the layout of the land. That's when I saw it. At first it blended in, but then I caught a faint reflection off the lens. Wedged into the crook of a tree directly facing the cabin's main window was a trail camera. It was strapped tightly around the trunk with a thick band, positioned at just the right angle to see straight inside. I walked closer, feeling a pit open in my stomach. It wasn't one of those old forgotten cameras. This one was modern, in good shape, with no sign of weather damage. Whoever had put it there had done so recently, and they had done it with care. I stood in front of it, staring at the dark glass. The whole time I couldn't shake the thought that maybe it was recording me at that very moment. I didn't touch it. Instead, I circled back toward the cabin, trying to stay calm. Inside, everything looked normal. My friends were sitting on the couches, talking, totally unaware that a lens was pointed right at them from the woods. I didn't tell them right away. I just sat down and tried to act like nothing was wrong. But my eyes kept drifting to the window. Eventually, I stepped back outside and called one of them over quietly. I showed him the tree and the camera. His face went pale the second he realized what he was looking at. Neither of us knew what to do. We didn't know if the camera was live or just storing images on a card. We didn't know who had put it there or how often they checked it. The fact that it was aimed directly at the only big window in the cabin was enough to make both of us uneasy. We debated taking it down, but the thought of touching something that belonged to whoever had set it up didn't sit right. What if they came back and saw we had moved it? What if they were nearby right then, watching us figure it out? For the rest of that day and into the night, the mood inside the cabin shifted. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody really relaxed. Every time someone moved near the window, you could see the awareness in their eyes, like they could feel the camera catching every second. We closed the curtains, but that didn't make it feel any better. If anything, it made the silence heavier. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside, the creak of wood, the rustle of leaves, felt like footsteps. I kept imagining someone walking up to check the camera, just a few feet from where I was lying in bed. At one point, I thought I heard the crunch of boots in the dirt near the porch, but when I finally got up the courage to look through the crack in the curtain, the yard was empty. By morning, we all knew we weren't staying. The hike back to the trailhead was long, but none of us wanted another night in that cabin. We packed quickly, barely eating, and kept glancing out the windows like we expected someone to appear. When we left, we didn't touch the camera. We didn't want to leave fingerprints, didn't want to trigger anything, didn't want to give whoever set it up any more reason to notice us. We walked out with our packs on, keeping our voices low even though we knew it was irrational. The hike back to the cars was tense. We didn't talk much, just moved quickly, always listening behind us. When we finally got to the lot, it felt like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. Even now, years later, I can still picture that camera, the way it was angled perfectly to look inside. I think about how many days it had been there before we noticed it, and how many nights it might have been recording us while we thought we were alone. We never found out who had put it there. Could have been a hunter, maybe, though why point it at a cabin window? Could have been someone from the rental company, though that didn't make sense either. The darker possibilities are the ones I try not to think about too much. But that trip changed the way I see remote cabins. I used to love the idea of staying somewhere far away from people, tucked into the woods where no one could bother me. Now I check every tree line, every corner of a room, because out there you don't always know who's watching or how close they might be. The memory that sticks with me most is that first moment when I noticed the faint reflection off the lens. I remember how quickly the feeling of peace drained out of me, replaced with the cold realization that we weren't as alone as we thought. And the worst part is knowing that whoever put it there probably saw everything before we even realized it. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping for some peace and quiet away from work and the noise of town. It was a small place, tucked down a gravel road deep in the forest, with a front porch that faced the trees and a narrow trail that wound toward a lake about half a mile away. The cabin wasn't fancy, just one bedroom, a little kitchen, and a porch with 2 old rocking chairs, but it was exactly what I wanted. The first 2 nights went by smoothly. I cooked simple meals, read books by lantern light, and sat on the porch listening to crickets. It was the kind of stillness I had been looking forward to for months. I slept with the windows cracked open, letting the cool air and faint forest sounds drift in. Nothing about it felt threatening. On the morning of the 3rd day, I stepped off the porch to stretch my legs. I usually walked the perimeter of the cabin before starting the day, just to get moving. I wandered around to the side, brushing past weeds, and then cut behind the porch where the ground dipped slightly toward the trees. That's when I noticed it. Right against the base of the cabin, in the dirt beneath the porch railing, was a small pile of cigarette butts. They were old enough to be weathered, but not so old that they had fallen apart. Some still had filters stained from fresh lips. There were at least 10 of them, all stacked together like someone had stood right there for a while, smoking one after another, and flicking the remains into the same spot. I froze. I don't smoke. Nobody I knew had been up there with me. I had been alone since the moment I arrived 2 nights earlier. My first thought was that they had been left by whoever rented the cabin before me. But then I remembered I had walked that same path around the cabin when I first arrived, checking things out, and I hadn't seen any cigarette butts then. If they had been there, I would have noticed. The pile wasn't small. It stood out against the bare dirt. That meant they had shown up after I got there. I crouched down and stared at them. The filters looked soft, like they hadn't been rained on yet. Some were bent slightly, pressed flat into the dirt where someone had stepped on them. The tracks around them were faint, but there were a few imprints that looked like the edge of a boot sole. A cold feeling crept into my stomach. Whoever had left them had been standing right behind the porch sometime in the past 2 nights, close enough to look up at the window or even step onto the boards if they wanted. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the trees, listening for any movement. Nothing stirred, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The woods looked empty, but I didn't feel alone. When I finally walked back inside, I couldn't relax the way I had before. Every time I sat in the rocking chair, I thought about someone standing just out of sight behind me, hidden by the railing, blowing smoke into the night while I sat only a few feet away reading. Every creak in the floorboards made me wonder if someone was creeping around outside. That night, I locked the door early. I pulled the curtains tight, double-checked the windows, and left a light on in the kitchen. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the butts. Whoever had been there might come back. Maybe they had been watching me since I arrived. Maybe they had been walking up when I was asleep, lingering in the shadows while I thought I was safe. I barely slept. Every sound carried. A branch snapping, a raccoon shuffling through the underbrush. Each one made my pulse quicken. I got up twice to look through the peephole in the door, but the yard was empty. The next morning, I forced myself to check the spot again. The pile of cigarette butts was still there, but this time it looked different. I noticed one more, a fresher one, resting on top that hadn't been there the day before. The filter was still white, only faintly stained, and it hadn't been flattened into the dirt like the others. That confirmed what I had been trying not to believe. Someone had been back there again during the night. I didn't waste time. I gathered my things and packed them into the car. My hands were shaking as I shoved my bag into the back seat, scanning the tree line over and over. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. Driving down that gravel road, the cabin disappearing behind me, I kept checking my mirrors. The woods seemed endless, and every bend in the road felt like an ambush waiting to happen. When I finally hit the paved road, I didn't stop until I was back in town. I never told the rental company. I didn't want to go back, didn't want to explain what I had seen, didn't even want to think about the place anymore. But the memory stuck with me. The idea that while I was sitting in the cabin, reading, cooking, or even sleeping, someone had been close enough to leave those cigarette butts just feet from the porch. They had been there quietly, standing in the dark, watching without me ever knowing. And the worst part was the fresh one I found that last morning. Proved I hadn't been imagining things. Whoever they were, they had come back while I slept, close enough to hear me moving around inside. Close enough that if they had wanted to, they could have walked up the steps, opened the door, and stepped inside. That thought has never left me. When I rent cabins now, I check everything, under porches, around windows, behind trees. I don't relax the way I used to, because I learned that just because you're alone in the woods doesn't mean you're truly alone. Sometimes someone is out there with you, leaving quiet little signs like cigarette butts in the dirt, and you don't notice until it's almost too late. The cabin I stayed in wasn't much more than a wooden box with a roof, tucked away in the middle of thick forest. It sat in a small clearing, with tall pines and dark undergrowth pressing close on every side. There was no running water inside, no plumbing, just a pump out back for fresh water, and a detached outhouse about 30 yards away down a short path. I had booked it for a long weekend, thinking I would enjoy the simplicity and silence of being cut off from everything. The first day was fine. I hauled my food and gear in, lit a fire in the wood stove, and spent the afternoon reading. By the time night fell, the quiet was almost overwhelming. I could hear every sound outside, the wind sifting through the branches, the occasional snap of something in the brush, even the wings of moths tapping against the cabin window. It was the kind of quiet that made small noises feel enormous. The outhouse sat on the edge of the clearing, half hidden by shadows when the lantern light from the cabin didn't reach that far. The path leading to it was just dirt, packed down by the few people who bothered to stay here over the years. I hadn't gone out to it after dark yet. That first night, I held off as long as I could, but after sitting around with a full stomach and drinking water by the stove, I eventually needed to make the walk. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cooler than it had been during the day, damp and heavy with the smell of pine. Gravel crunched under my boots as I walked the short stretch of path. My light bounced over the trees and caught the little wooden outhouse, its door hanging slightly crooked on the hinges. As I got closer, I slowed down. The beam of my flashlight hit the cracks in the wooden walls, and I caught what looked like a flicker of movement inside. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe my own shadow stretching oddly across the boards, but when I shifted the angle, I saw it again. Something moved inside. I froze. The outhouse was too small for shadows to play tricks like that. Someone was in there. I stood a few feet from the door, holding my breath, trying to listen. There was no sound, no rustle of clothes, no creak of wood, nothing. Just silence pressing in, thick and heavy. I gripped the flashlight tighter and finally reached out, pushing the door open with the tips of my fingers. The hinges groaned. The outhouse was empty. I swept the beam of the light across the inside. The wooden seat was down. A roll of toilet paper sat on a little shelf. The smell of damp earth and old wood filled the air, but no one was there. That's when I looked down. On the dirt floor, leading straight out of the doorway, were fresh footprints. Muddy, dark, still wet enough to shine under the beam of my light. Bare footprints, not boots or shoes. They were clear and sharp, pressed deep into the earth, as if someone had stepped out only moments before I opened the door. The trail of prints led out of the outhouse, across the small patch of dirt, and into the trees at the edge of the clearing. They didn't wander or scatter. They went straight, like whoever had left them hadn't been running but walking calmly, deliberately, back into the forest. My chest tightened. I turned the light toward the tree line, but it didn't reach far. All I could see were the closest trunks, pale against the blackness, the shadows between them swallowing everything else. I backed away from the outhouse, scanning left and right, trying to catch movement. The forest seemed to breathe. Every branch that shifted made my nerves jump. My first thought was that someone had been hiding inside, waiting, maybe watching me through the cracks in the walls as I walked up. And then, just before I opened the door, they had slipped out. But how had I not heard them? The ground around the cabin wasn't silent. Dry twigs and needles littered the forest floor. Even a deer moving through made enough sound to catch. Yet whoever it was had left in silence, leaving only the muddy trail behind. I forced myself back to the cabin, every step feeling like I was being watched. My hand shook when I slid the lock into place on the door. I turned off the flashlight and stood there in the dim lantern glow, trying to breathe slowly, trying to think. The rest of the night stretched on endlessly. I sat by the window with the lantern low, staring out into the clearing, waiting for something to move. I never saw anyone, but the forest never felt still again. When the sun finally came up, I walked back out to the outhouse, needing to see the prints again in daylight. They were still there, damp in the morning air, leading from the doorway to the trees. I followed them a few steps, but the farther they went, the fainter they became. By the time they reached the darker soil under the pines, they blended into the ground and disappeared. I stood there, staring into the trees, trying to imagine who it had been. A hiker who wandered close? Someone living rough in the woods? Or something worse? Someone who had been watching the cabin, waiting for a chance? That was my last night there. I packed up my things and left before it got dark again. The cabin hadn't felt like a retreat anymore. It felt like bait, sitting alone in that clearing with only thin walls and an old lock on the door. Even now, I can still see the muddy prints in my mind, sharp and fresh in the beam of my flashlight. They told me I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been closer than I ever realized, slipping in and out of the dark without a sound, leaving only their steps behind as proof. And the worst part was knowing I had walked right up to them, close enough to open the door on a space they had just been in, without ever catching them in the act. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. They knew I was alone, and they had been careful enough to vanish back into the trees before I could do anything about it. That thought has never left me. The cabin we rented wasn't much more than a box of rough wood with a porch and a couple of small windows, but it sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest road. That was the appeal. Quiet, no neighbors, just the sound of the trees swaying and a creek running not far behind it. We had driven several hours to get there, winding through smaller and smaller roads until finally hitting a gravel track that led down into the trees. The first night passed uneventfully. The cabin was old but cozy. The stove worked, the lantern light gave it a warm glow, and the air outside was filled with the hum of crickets. We stayed up later than we should have, just enjoying the stillness, the way the night seemed to swallow us whole. The silence was so complete it almost felt heavy. When I finally fell asleep, it was the kind of deep, heavy sleep you only get when you've been out in the fresh air all day. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, dull, like something shifting against wood. My first thought was a branch falling, but it hadn't been windy. The woods outside were still, almost unnaturally quiet. I lay there listening, waiting for it again, but nothing came. I eventually drifted back into a restless sleep. It wasn't until morning that I understood what had happened. I walked into the back room, and the air felt colder than it should have. When I looked toward the rear wall, my stomach dropped. The back window was shattered. The glass lay across the floor in jagged pieces, glittering in the morning light. In the middle of the mess, sitting on the worn wooden floorboards just beneath the broken frame, was a heavy rock. The thing looked like it had been pulled straight from the creek bed. Rounded, gray, big enough to fill both hands. It sat there like it had been placed deliberately. Nothing else in the cabin was disturbed. The few bags we had brought were still there, zipped up, untouched. The food in the corner remained stacked. The lanterns and tools on the shelf were exactly as we had left them. It was just the window, smashed open from the outside, with the rock inside as the only clue. I stood there staring, every detail burning into my mind. The hole in the glass was large enough for someone to crawl through, but no one had. The window sat low to the ground on the outside wall, so whoever had done it would have been crouched close to the cabin, hidden in the dark. The idea of someone being out there, standing in the night just feet from where we slept, made my skin crawl. I kept circling back to the same question: why? If it had been theft, something would have been missing. If it had been kids playing around, why here in the middle of nowhere? And if it had been anger, some random vandalism, why choose a cabin hidden away from everything else? It didn't make sense. The rock felt like a message more than anything. I thought back to the sound that had woken me, that dull thud. It hadn't been a branch at all. It had been the rock crashing through the glass, landing on the floor just a few feet away from where I'd been sleeping. The rest of the morning, I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground, looking for tracks. The soil back there was packed down, a mix of dirt and pine needles, not great for leaving prints. I thought I saw impressions in a few places, but they could have been mine from when I first carried wood around. There was no clear trail, no proof of who or what had been there. The woods themselves gave nothing away. They stood silent, looming, as if whatever had moved there in the night was long gone. But the silence didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. Inside, the cabin no longer felt safe. Every wall felt thin. Every window seemed fragile, just another easy point of entry. I kept imagining the rock flying through the glass while I had been asleep, imagining someone crouched in the dark, staring at the cabin, deciding what to do. Maybe they had meant to come in. Maybe something had stopped them. Or maybe the rock was all they wanted to leave behind. A warning, or a reminder that we weren't as alone as we thought. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the cot, listening for every sound, heart thudding with each snap in the brush. Shadows from the lanterns stretched across the walls, and every shift of them felt alive. The image of the rock on the floor stayed burned in my mind, heavy and deliberate. By morning, the decision was easy. We packed our bags, loaded the car, and left the cabin behind. The woods felt different on the way out, as if they had closed in overnight, their silence heavier than before. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, watching the trees swallow the narrow track as we drove away, the cabin vanishing behind us. Nothing had been stolen, and nothing had been said. Just a shattered window and a rock sitting on the floor, like proof that someone had been close enough to reach us, but had chosen not to take that final step. That was worse than if they had broken in. It meant they had been in control the entire time, watching, deciding. Even now, I can still picture the way it looked in the morning light. The broken glass spread across the floor, the cold air seeping in, and that heavy rock sitting quietly, almost like it had been left as a gift. A reminder that someone had been there, and that we had slept through it all. And the part that unsettles me most is knowing they could have come inside if they had wanted to. Nothing had stopped them but their own choice. We were never really safe out there. We were only left alone because someone decided to leave us that way. I still remember the smell of the cabin when we first walked in. It was that mix of fresh pine from the wooden beams and a faint mustiness from being closed up for too long. We had rented it for a week as a family getaway, tucked away in the mountains where cell service cut out and the only sounds were wind through the trees and the creak of the wooden deck under your boots. The pictures online showed a big living room with high ceilings, a stone fireplace, and a view that looked out over rolling forest. It seemed perfect, the kind of place you see on postcards. The cabin was larger than I expected, more like a small lodge. 2 floors above ground, wide porches, and a heavy stone base that held up the rest of it. There were a few things that gave me pause as soon as I walked around, though. The driveway was rutted and overgrown, suggesting nobody had stayed there for months. The back porch boards were warped, like they had taken on too much rainwater. Still, that wasn't unusual for mountain cabins. I brushed it off. The main level was cozy enough, and the kids immediately claimed their rooms upstairs. My wife unpacked groceries into the old fridge. I went exploring because I like to know the layout of any place I'm staying. That was when I noticed the narrow door under the stairs, almost hidden. It had a cold metal latch and led down a steep set of stone steps. The listing online hadn't mentioned a basement. My first thought was that it might be a root cellar or just a storage space. I pulled the light chain at the top of the stairs, and a weak bulb flickered to life. The air that rose up felt damp and colder than it should have been, like it had been trapped down there for a long time. I stepped down carefully, the stone steps slick in spots, and reached the basement floor. It wasn't like most basements I've been in. It wasn't finished, but it wasn't raw dirt either. The floor was thick stone slabs, irregular but tightly fitted, like it had been laid decades ago. The walls were rough rock, the kind you'd see in old cellars. It smelled strongly of iron and mildew. Then I noticed the chains. They were heavy, thick links of rusted iron, bolted directly into the stone floor with massive anchors. There were 3 of them spread out in a triangle pattern across the room. Each one was long enough to extend maybe 5 or 6 feet, but no more. The ends were fitted with heavy shackles, the kind that looked too solid to bend or break. The sight stopped me cold. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was for animals? Maybe someone kept big dogs down here? But the basement didn't look like any kennel. There were no food bowls, no signs of bedding, no chew marks. The bolts looked like they had been part of the floor for decades, not some temporary setup. The stone around each anchor was discolored, darker, as if moisture or rust had bled into it for years. I crouched to look closer. The shackles were sized for wrists or ankles, not animals. The insides were smooth from use, not rough and sharp like you'd expect if they'd just been sitting. That was when I noticed faint scratches on the stone near one chain, shallow lines that spread outward in arcs. They weren't natural. A wave of unease rolled over me. This wasn't something left over from a quirky hobby. This wasn't hunting equipment or a decoration. These chains had been used and used often. I went back upstairs trying to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every time I sat in the living room, I thought about what was below me, directly under the floor where my family was walking and sleeping. The sound of the old fridge humming in the kitchen reminded me of the silence in that basement, where the air seemed heavier. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me think of those chains. I imagined footsteps on the stone or the sound of metal dragging. The logical side of my mind kept saying they were just old fixtures, maybe from when the cabin was built. But the other side, the part reacting to the cold sweat on my back, knew there was more to it. The next day, I brought it up with the rental owner over email. I didn't ask in an accusing way. I just wrote that I had noticed chains in the basement and wondered what they were for. Hours passed with no reply. Finally, late that night, I got a short message back. The basement is not meant for use. Please keep the door closed. That was all. No explanation, no reassurance, nothing. That made it worse. If it was nothing, they would have said so. If it was some harmless thing, they would have explained. Instead, they brushed it off. That silence was louder than any words. I tried to enjoy the rest of the trip for the sake of my family, but my eyes kept drifting to the door under the stairs. I made sure it was latched every night. I noticed the kids avoided it too, even without me mentioning anything. They said it smelled weird down there, and they didn't like the feeling it gave them. By the third night, I started hearing something faint at night. It wasn't loud, but it was there if you listened long enough. A dull clinking, like metal shifting slightly under strain. At first I thought it was just pipes or the cabin settling, but the sound was too irregular. Came in bursts, then silence, then again. I never opened the basement door after dark, but I lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing those chains were directly beneath me. I couldn't shake the thought of who or what had once been locked down there. My mind went to dark places. Captives, prisoners, people who had screamed but were too far from neighbors to be heard. I thought about how no one had mentioned this in the listing, how the owner avoided explaining it, and I realized maybe nobody wanted outsiders to know. On the last morning before we checked out, I went down one final time, needing to be sure of what I had seen. The chains were still there, heavy and silent. I knelt to touch one, and the cold metal left a faint orange residue on my fingers. The shackles were stiff but still functional. I could imagine them clicking shut around a wrist or ankle. That image stayed with me the entire drive home. After the trip, I kept checking the listing out of curiosity. A few weeks later, it was gone. No record of the cabin being available, no way to find the page again. It was like it had never been there. The owner never responded to my follow-up messages. I don't know the history of that place. Maybe I never will. But I do know this: those chains were not for animals, and they weren't decorative. They were used for something that no one wanted to talk about, and I had brought my family to sleep above them, unaware of what had taken place in that basement. The worst part is thinking about how old they were. The rust, the wear, the deep stains in the stone all suggested years, maybe decades of use. That means countless nights, countless people, bound and left there in the dark while life went on above. We left and nothing happened to us directly, but I still wake up sometimes with the memory of those cold shackles, the faint scratches on the floor, and the heavy silence in that basement. That cabin is still out there somewhere, hidden off a mountain road, sitting quiet with its secrets. And the chains will still be there, waiting in the stone floor, holding stories no one wants to tell. I rented the cabin because I wanted to get away from everything. I had been buried in work for months, and I wanted to spend a week in the mountains, far from traffic, far from emails, far from anyone else. The place I found wasn't fancy. It was older, built mostly from rough timber and stone, but it sat on a ridge with a wide porch that overlooked endless trees. The listing had been straightforward. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove, no Wi-Fi, and limited cell service. That was what I wanted: quiet. When I arrived, I noticed right away that the cabin hadn't been updated in a long time. The floors were uneven, the walls carried the smell of old wood, and the furniture was worn but sturdy. There was a big stone fireplace in the living room and a single lamp that gave off a yellow, tired light. I unloaded my stuff, set down groceries, and walked through the rooms. That was when I noticed the phone. It sat on a small table in the corner of the living room. An old landline, the kind with a heavy receiver and a rotary dial that was cracked and stuck in places. The cord was curled and stiff with age, and when I traced it down with my hand, I saw that it ran along the floor, through a hole in the wall, and stopped. It wasn't connected to anything, just a cut wire dangling loose. I assumed it was left there as decoration, or maybe whoever owned the place hadn't bothered throwing it out. It didn't bother me. I even thought it added some character, like an artifact from when the cabin had first been used. That first day passed quietly. I split some wood, got a fire going, and sat out on the porch until the sun dropped and the trees faded into black shapes. By nightfall, the silence was heavier than I expected. Out there, you notice how much you depend on background noise in the city: traffic, neighbors, TV. Here, it was only the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap from the wood beams settling. I went to bed with the kind of tiredness that comes from travel and fresh air. But sometime after midnight, I was woken by a sound that cut through the silence. It was sharp, sudden, and impossible to mistake. The phone rang. That old rotary phone in the living room, the one with no line, no connection. It rang like it was alive. The tone was harsh and mechanical, not like modern ringers, but the kind that fills a whole room. It echoed in the dark cabin, bouncing off the wood and stone. For a moment, I just lay there in bed, heart thumping. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe it was the wind rattling something. But then it rang again, loud, clear. I got up, barefoot on the cold floor, and walked slowly toward the living room. The sound didn't stop. It rang a third time, vibrating the table it sat on. I picked it up. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just silence. Then I heard it, a faint, steady breathing. Someone was on the other end, listening. Not words, not noise, just breathing, close enough to the receiver that I could picture them standing there with the phone pressed to their face. I stood frozen, every part of me tense. The fire had burned down to faint orange coals, and the only light in the room was the glow from them. The breathing continued, slow and calm. Then it stopped. The line went dead, and I was left standing there with the receiver pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. I set it back down carefully, like it might come alive again if I wasn't gentle. My body felt tight with unease, and my mind kept scrambling for explanations. Maybe it had somehow kept power in it, some stored charge that made it ring. But that didn't explain the breathing. I sat awake the rest of the night, unable to close my eyes. Every creak in the walls made me think of footsteps. Every gust of wind outside sounded like movement. When the first light came through the windows, I felt a little braver. I went to check the phone again. The cord was still dangling free through the hole in the wall, cut and frayed. There was no way it had a connection. I followed the wire outside, just to be sure. It stopped a few feet beyond the cabin wall, curled up under weeds and dirt. There was nothing for it to connect to. No pole, no box, nothing. That left me with only one conclusion. Someone had been inside the cabin. Someone had wired that phone to ring, or had sat outside with some device, or had replaced it before I arrived. Whatever the method, the point was the same. Someone had planned for me to hear it. Someone wanted me to pick it up. The more I thought about it, the less it felt like a glitch or a trick of old technology. The breathing had been too clear, too steady. That was a real person. I started noticing things I hadn't before. A mark in the dust near the back door, like something had been dragged. A scuff on the floor by the window that didn't match the rest of the wear. Little signs that maybe I wasn't alone as I thought. I thought about leaving right then, but the road was long and rough, and I was tired. Instead, I stayed through the day, never letting the phone out of my sight. I checked every window lock, every door, every corner of the cabin. Nothing looked out of place, but the feeling never left me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair near the fireplace with my bag packed and my keys in my pocket, waiting. The phone stayed quiet, sitting in the corner like a dead thing. The hours crawled by, every minute making me more certain that I shouldn't have come. By dawn, I made up my mind. I left the cabin as it was, didn't bother cleaning up, didn't even finish the food in the fridge. I locked the front door behind me, even though it didn't feel like that would matter. On the drive down the mountain, my phone finally picked up service. I pulled over and checked the cabin's listing again. It was still there, still advertised as a cozy retreat, with the same photos of the porch and the fireplace. But nowhere did it show that old landline. No mention of it. No sign it existed at all. To anyone else, it would just be another rental, another getaway spot. But I know what I heard. The sound of that phone ringing still lives in my head. The way it cut through the silence, and the breathing on the other end that proved it wasn't a glitch or a ghost story. Someone was there. Someone used that phone to remind me I wasn't alone. And the worst part is knowing they might still be doing it to whoever rents the place next, waiting for the quiet hours of the night, waiting for someone to pick up and listen. I had rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be the quiet break I needed. The listing showed it tucked deep in the woods, no neighbors close by, just a simple wooden place with a porch and a small trail that wound down toward a creek. The first day went as planned. I hauled my bags inside, stocked the fridge with what I brought, and lit a fire in the old stone fireplace. The cabin had that dry, woody smell of old timbers, mixed with faint dust, but it felt peaceful. It was later that night, when I was sitting by the fire reading, that I noticed it. A smell, smoke, but not from my fireplace. My fire had already died down to embers, and this was different. Fainter, thinner, carried on the draft that slipped through the cracks in the windows. It smelled like campfire smoke, but distant. I went outside on the porch, expecting maybe to see a chimney puff in the distance, but there was nothing but dark woods and stars above the tree line. The air was still, but the smell hung there. I told myself it was nothing. The cabin itself had probably absorbed years of smoke from fires, and the old wood was releasing it at night. That seemed reasonable enough, so I went back inside. But the next night, the smell returned. Stronger this time. It drifted in not long after dark, seeping through the still air. Again, I stepped out on the porch. The forest was black, the only light from the faint glow of the moon. There was no firelight in the trees, no movement, nothing, just the smell. I sat awake longer than I should have, restless, listening to the silence, my nose catching faint hints of smoke until I finally fell asleep in the chair. By the third night, it had become a pattern. The sun went down, and with it came the smell, like someone burning wood not far away. It unsettled me because it didn't make sense. Cabins were spread far apart out there, miles in some cases. If someone was camping close by, I should have noticed during the day. The following morning, I decided to look. I told myself it was probably nothing more than curiosity, but in truth, it was gnawing at me. I couldn't relax in that cabin without knowing. So after breakfast, I headed into the trees in the direction the smell seemed to come from the night before. It didn't take long. Maybe 200, 300 yards from the cabin, just over a rise where the trees grew thick, I found it. A tent. Small, cheap-looking, faded by weather. Next to it, a ring of stones making a fire pit. Inside the ring, the ashes were gray but still warm, and when I touched them lightly with a stick, a thin curl of smoke rose up. Whoever had been there had made a fire not long ago. The tent was zipped shut. I stood there a while, staring at it, waiting for some sound, some movement, but there was nothing. No backpacks, no shoes outside, no sign of food or supplies. Just the tent, the fire pit, and the faint smell of burned wood. I didn't open it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to invade someone else's space. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find. Instead, I backed away and made my way to the cabin again, trying to convince myself it was just another camper, someone passing through, nothing more. But as the hours went by, the thought dug deeper into me. Who camps that close to a rental cabin? Why would they choose that exact spot when the forest is endless and empty? And why hadn't I seen or heard anyone? That night, the smell returned as usual, stronger than ever, like the fire was closer. I sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the woods, my stomach tight with unease. I thought I heard a faint crack of branches at one point, but it might have been an animal. The smoke smell drifted through the window cracks again and again, and I kept picturing the tent sitting there in the trees, quiet, zipped up, with nobody ever stepping out. The next morning, I went back. The ashes in the fire pit were fresh again. Not just warm this time, smoldering, with the faint glow of embers. The tent was still zipped, still silent, no sign of anyone around. The air was heavy with smoke. I circled the site slowly, looking for footprints, gear, anything that would tell me who was staying there. But the ground was hard, leaves scattered, and nothing stood out. It looked staged, almost like a setup left for me to find. I returned to the cabin, more unsettled than before. Every instinct told me something wasn't right. If someone was living out there, they would have shown themselves. They would have made noise, left trash, walked to the creek. But nothing changed. Each night the smoke rolled in like a clock, steady and unbroken. By the fifth day, I couldn't take it. I went back once more early in the morning. The fire pit was smoldering again, the same faint curl of smoke. I finally forced myself to crouch by the tent. My hands shook as I touched the zipper. I pulled it halfway down and looked inside. Empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, no clothes. Just dirt and leaves pressed into the floor, as if it had been set up quickly and left alone. I backed away, my chest tight, my heart racing. There was no way someone was actually living there, but the fires kept burning. The smoke kept coming. I didn't stay another night. I packed my bags that afternoon and drove back down the mountain road before dark. The whole way, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees as I left. When I got home, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some local using the woods. Maybe it was kids or a hunter or a drifter. But the truth kept circling back. Whoever it was, they never showed themselves, and they kept that fire alive every night, close enough for me to smell from the cabin, close enough for me to notice. It wasn't careless. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, and that's what stays with me. The thought that someone had chosen that exact spot to light fires, night after night, within sight of my cabin, never once letting me see them. They wanted me to know they were there, but never wanted me to know who they were. That kind of silence is worse than any noise, because it means someone was watching, hidden in the trees, keeping just close enough to remind me I was never alone.